I'm going to start from Genesis 32, verse 22. Jacob wrestles with God. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. We're then going to turn to Mark's Gospel, chapter 7. I'm going to start at verse 24. Jesus honors a Syrophoenician woman's faith. Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. "First, let the children eat all they want," he told her, "for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Lord," she replied, "even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he told her, "For such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." She went home and found her child lying on the bed, and the demon gone.
So children, you are welcome to come up to the front, and we've got a children's talk for you before the sermon. So come on down the front here. Now, the Bible reading that we just had and the sermon that's about to happen, it's about two examples of people who met God, met Jesus. A woman met Jesus, and a man, Jacob, he wrestled with God. And I'm going to try and illustrate a word that comes up in both of these stories, and it's about trusting in God, or faith. Faith is, well, it's a way of life. It's a commitment to Jesus, trusting him for salvation. And I want to illustrate, now if you have a look at this, boys, see this chair. Do you think that chair will hold me if I sit in it? Would I have faith in that chair to sit in it? I think I have. I'm going to sit in this chair. See what happens. That's quite a comfortable pew, actually. So I'm having faith, trusting in this chair. But what about this chair? Would one of you like to sit in it? Yep, come on, sit down. You're now trusting in that chair that you can sit. Oh, you're sitting very comfortably. You can just stay there if you like, okay? What about this little stool here? Now, I made this when I was in year 7, when I was probably just a little bit older than you. Do you think that if I stood on that, it would take my weight. I've got to trust that chair. Look at that. See? Now, I want to try and illustrate faith and trust in a different way. I might just have to leave the microphone for a moment. I've got a glass and we've got some water. It's just normal water that you can drink. Put the water in there. Now, do you think that this little coaster will be able to hold the water if I tip it upside down? Let's try it out over this area here. Now, some people think I've got little faith because there's a towel down here. See, so I put the coaster on, turn it over like that. Now, if I take my hand away, see, it does. Now, I'm going to test your faith. Who would like to sit on the towel and I'll do it again? Come on, Mary. You sit on the towel, you know what might happen. So this is an exercise of faith. I'm tipping it up, upside down, and I'm taking my hand away now. I think you better give them an applause, because that was very good. So we'll find out, if you listen to the sermon, you'll find out about people who wrestled with God and had faith in God. And Jesus encouraged that faith and acknowledged it. And Jacob, who ended up being crippled, came away from that a new man with faith in God. And I hope that you might be able to understand a little bit more about faith and trusting in God for salvation through this little illustration today. Thank you very much. You can go back to your seats now.
To be a baptism. Well, it's good to be with you here this morning. I think it's the first time I've been, well, it's not the first time I've been with you as a congregation. I was with you when you used to meet over, first of all, at the skate park, I think. And then you moved into the Salvation Army place. I think I've been there and preached there, but I haven't been in the school before. So it's lovely to see how the congregation has grown, and you've got the same kind of problems that we've got in the Prezi Church. You've got congregations without buildings, and in some ways, there's an advantage not having a building. In other ways, it can be quite frustrating. But it's really good to see that there are churches, there are congregations on the ground here, both in Hobart and south of Hobart, that weren't here 20, 30 years ago. And we continue to pray that God will multiply churches like this. So I want to speak to you from that passage in Mark chapter 7. If you've got a Bible or a device that you can open up, it's only a small passage. It's an incident that happens and is recorded both in Matthew's Gospel but also in Mark's Gospel with a few slight differences. It'll be helpful if you have it in front of you so you can see that I'm not making this up. I'm trying to expound what's actually there in the Bible. There was a guy called Carl Henry who used to be the editor of Christianity Today, which is a well-known Christian publication. And in one of his editorials, he wrote this years ago now: some people live all of their lives just around the corner from the world of truth. Some people live all of their lives just around the corner from the world of truth. You may think of somebody like Jordan Peterson at the moment. He's not there yet. He seems to be very close. He seems to understand a lot about the Bible. He actually preaches sometimes from the Bible, but he's not there. He's just round the corner. Or Tom Holland, another one. Or even Richard Dawkins, who now identifies as a cultural Christian. That's a move in the right direction, but he's not there yet. And some people are like that. They kind of skirt around the borders of Christianity, just around the corner. And that's literally true, of course, for this woman. She's a Greek-speaking Syro-Phoenician by birth, according to verse 26. Geographically, she lived just outside the borders of Israel, the Promised Land. And spiritually, as we shall see, I hope, this morning, she wasn't far from the kingdom. She lived just around the corner from the world of truth. The trouble is, as I just said, most of us are quite content to stay there because the truth can be very confronting. Richard Dawkins says that he's a cultural Christian because he likes singing Christmas carols and he likes seeing parish churches. He wouldn't like to see mosques on the landscape. He sees the benefits of Christianity, but he can't bring himself to believe in the source of all that. He's just around the corner, maybe a long way around the corner at the moment. Because the truth, it can be difficult to live with. It can be confronting. And we have 1,001 ways to avoid it. So we're quite happy to continue living just round the corner. And maybe that's where you are this morning. I don't know all of you that well. Maybe that's where you are this morning. Like I was when I was growing up in church all those years ago. My father was a Sunday school superintendent. He was an elder. And I had to go to church 3 times on a Sunday, and I hated it. So I was there like a good church boy, but I wasn't a Christian. I was listening to sermons. They weren't very good. They weren't really based on the Bible. But I wasn't there. I hadn't entered into the faith. I hadn't entered into the benefits of what Jesus had done for me on the cross. And maybe that's where you are this morning. Still checking things out. Not yet totally committed to Jesus. Still keeping your distance. Maybe you're here to keep the family peace like I was when I was a kid growing up. You're still round the corner. You haven't come in yet. But what happens, and this happened to me on a Sunday night, I'm trying to remember how many, more than 50 years ago, 60 years ago. What happens when the truth actually comes around the corner to meet you? That's what I'm praying will happen this morning. What happens when the truth comes around the corner to meet you? That's what happened here to this woman, isn't it? Literally and spiritually, Jesus, who is the truth incarnate, walked into her life. And she was never the same again. This is the only occasion I can think of in the Gospels where Jesus steps outside of Israel into Gentile territory. Why? I mean, what's going on here? I want you to see 3 things. I always like to have 3 points. And they say if you knock a Welshman over, he'll split into 3. So what is Jesus doing here? I want you to see 3 things. A divine appointment, a very awkward conversation, and an amazing outcome. So what is Jesus doing here? Why does Jesus leave the promised land to go into pagan territory? What is he doing there in Gentile territory? Now, some commentators suggest he's having a break. He's on holiday. He's taking a well-earned break with his disciples. They've had a pretty busy time of it. If you read through Mark's gospel, it marks a very fast-paced gospel, and lots of things have been happening. from chapter 6 onwards, the crowds keep catching up with him, clamoring for him to perform miracles. And here in chapter 7, he's just had a rather heated exchange with the religious teachers. And so he steps over the border to take time out with his disciples. And who can blame him? That would explain why they're so irritable, the disciples. Did you notice that? They're really annoyed with this woman for interrupting their time away with Jesus. Look at verse 24. We're told he entered a house and didn't want anyone to know it. Yet he could not keep his presence secret. You know what it's like. Just as you're beginning to relax and unwind, like Keith is doing right now, I suppose. Just as you're beginning to relax and unwind, the phone goes. I know it's your day off, but maybe it's that kind of a scenario. It's a weekend away. Maybe that's what he's doing here in the vicinity of Tyre. But I want to suggest to you this morning that there's a far more profound reason for this. There's a much deeper reason for this little excursion into Gentile territory. Maybe, unbeknown to his disciples, Jesus has an appointment to keep. Jesus keeps appointments with people. An appointment made before you were born, an appointment made in eternity, before the world was made. Remember that incident in John chapter 4? John tells us that he must needs go through Samaria. Why did he need to go through Samaria? The Jews usually avoided Samaria. Jews and Samaritans had nothing to do with each other. But the old King James Version puts it like this: he must needs go through Samaria. Why? Because there was a woman there at the well whose life was really messed up, and he had an appointment to keep with her. An appointment made in eternity. And in the course of that conversation with that woman at the well, her life was changed. And not only her life, but the life of the Samaritans, because revival broke out as a result of that conversation there at the well. And maybe something like that is happening here. Not maybe. Certainly, I think something like that is happening here. Jesus has an appointment to keep with this woman. Paul explains it like this in Romans chapter 8, that very well-known verse. You know, in Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, he says, all things, we know that all things work together for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. I want to suggest to you that that is the real behind-the-scenes explanation of what's happening here. Notice what Paul says, all things. Does that include a demon-possessed daughter? What brought this woman to Christ? It was an unimaginable evil, wasn't it? She had a demon-possessed daughter. Now, it's hard for us to imagine what that must be like. We don't see that sort of thing in our culture. Just imagine, we've seen things on our TV that we didn't want to see this last week, haven't we? That terrible thing in Bondi Junction. And then the parents of that guy coming on and talking about their son. Can you imagine what it must be like to be the parents of that guy? He was mentally ill. He had a psychotic episode. Can you imagine what that must have been like? Or think of those poor parents of the guy who was radicalized by some extremist group to try and assassinate the bishop there in Western Sydney. Imagine what they were too scared to go home. Imagine what it must be like. Imagine what it must be like to have a kid who's in the grip of some terrible addiction. And when I was in Ann Street in Brisbane, we were right on King George Square, and often on a Friday night or Saturday night, you'd see these, and you see it all the time now, don't you? These teenage kids wandering around with knives, some of them on ice, and their faces are contorted by the addiction that they imagine what that must be like. Well, this is 1,000 times worse. She has a daughter who is possessed with the devil. Imagine what that must be like. J.C. Ryle says, this mother no doubt had been sorely tried. That's an understatement. She'd seen her darling daughter vexed with the devil and been unable to relieve her. But yet, he says, that trouble brought her to Christ and taught her to pray. Without it, she might have lived and died in careless ignorance and never seen Jesus at all. Surely, he says, it was good for her that she was afflicted. Doesn't sound like the prosperity gospel, does it? Surely, he says, it was good for her that she was afflicted. Mark this well, he says, there's nothing which shows our ignorance so much as our impatience under trouble. We forget that every cross is a message from God and intended to do us good in the end. Trials are intended to make us think, to wean us away from the world, to send us to our Bibles, to drive us to our knees. Health is a good thing, he says, but sickness is far better if it leads us to God. Prosperity is a great mercy, but adversity is a greater one if it brings us to Christ. Anything, says Ryle, is better than living in carelessness and dying in sin. Better 1,000 times to be afflicted like this woman and like her flee to Christ than to live at ease like the rich fool and die at last without Christ and without hope. Do you see the point? Do you see what he's saying? There is great blessing wrapped up in the ugly circumstances of this woman's life. Now, I don't know what your circumstances are. I don't know what trials you might be going through right now. But Paul says, whatever, all things, good things and bad things, all things work together for the good of those who are the called according to his purpose. And that's not a blanket statement. He's not saying, she'll be right. He's not saying, what they used to say after the war there, pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile. That's not faith. That's fatalism. Don't confuse the two things. It'll all turn out all right. It'll all turn out all right in the end, people say. No, it won't, my friends. It won't turn out all right in the end for you unless you believe in Jesus. But if you do believe in Jesus, then all things will work together for your everlasting good. God will use everything to conform you to the image of his Son. Do you see? God is not the author of evil. God is not to blame for all the bad things that happen to you. But he can use even the worst things in your life to bring you to himself. And he does. Just read the Gospels. Look at all the people who came to him in the Gospels. Usually they came out of great suffering and difficulties. So here's this poor woman in desperate need. And Jesus knows that. Here's this woman in desperate need, and she's got a demon-possessed daughter, and he has the power to cast out demons. Here's this woman, and Jesus just happens to be there in the vicinity. What a stroke of luck. No, it's the electing, predestinating love of God. That's what it is. This sovereign God who is in control of all the circumstances of our lives, the big things that are happening in the world right now. He's in charge of all that. He knows what's happening. He can bring good out of the most terrible evil. The things that are happening now, we wonder, where is this all going to end up? And God is at work, even in the big things that are happening, bringing down barriers, opening up borders, allowing the gospel to get in where otherwise it would not have got in. He is in control of all the circumstances of your life too. And he can bring the greatest good out of the most severe trial. Think of Joseph and his brothers. Joseph and his amazing Technicolor dream coat. Remember what they did with him? They threw him in a ditch, wanting to get rid of him. They were jealous of him. I mean, it's his own fault. He kind of provoked them a bit by the things he was saying, but they remember his brothers. They threw him in a pit in the ground and thought they'd got rid of him. And then a famine came, and they found themselves in Egypt looking for food. And to their amazement, and perhaps even to their horror at first, they saw that this brother who they thought they'd got rid of is now second in command of the most powerful nation on earth. He's next to the Pharaoh, and he's in charge of all the food stores in Egypt. And remember, once it dawns on them, that's Joseph. That's our brother Joseph. What's going to happen to us now? He's one of the most powerful men in the world. And Joseph, remember what Joseph says to them? What you meant for evil, God meant for good. Yeah, what you did was evil. But what you meant for evil, God meant for good, to save many people through this famine. Think of the cross. Remember what Peter said on the day of Pentecost? Talk about a straight shooter on the day of Pentecost. Here's Peter. This is his sermon to the people who had crucified Jesus there in Jerusalem. He says to them, him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. What's happened in Jerusalem is according to the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. Him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, you have taken and by wicked hands have crucified and slain. He doesn't let them off the hook, you see. They're responsible for their actions. The worst thing that could ever have happened, deicide, the most unimaginable evil. You took the Son of God and crucified him. But do you realize that was according to the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God? Out of the greatest evil has come the greatest good. Greatest thing that's ever happened in this world. Do you see? That's how the sovereignty of God works. So, this is not an unwelcome interruption to Jesus' weekend away. It is the keeping of an appointment made in eternity, and it leads into a very awkward conversation, doesn't it? That's the second point. Just look at the way Jesus deals with this woman in her need. It's quite shocking when you think about it. She comes, think of her now, think of what's going on here. Try and imagine yourself into the situation. She begged Jesus, we're told. Her heart's breaking. She's had sleepless nights. She's heard that Jesus is in the vicinity, and she comes. She begs Jesus to, verse 26, she begs Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter, it says. And what does Jesus say? What does Jesus do? He insults her. Not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs, he says. That's not very Christian, is it? That's no way to treat a lady. At best, it's insensitive. At worst, it's downright rude and positively insulting. See, the Jews called the Gentiles dogs. It's like the paddy wagons in New York, to cart away the drunk Irishmen. It's an insult. The Jews referred to the Gentile, anyone who was not a Jew as a dog as far as they were concerned. Get away from me, you Gentile dog. What have I got to do with you? I came only for the lost tribes of the house of Israel, not for Gentiles like you. Sounds so harsh, doesn't it? It's sexist and racist and bigoted. I can't believe these words are coming out of the mouth of Jesus. Are they? See, Mark tells us that she was a Greek-speaking Syro-Phoenician. And if they were speaking Greek, which they would have been rather than Aramaic, then the word would be a diminutive. It would be puppy dog or little dog. That makes a little bit of a difference. Not the wild dogs, the unclean animals who were scavenging in the dustbins, but a household pet. Now, I don't think I'd like to be called a dog, but I don't think I'd mind so much to be called a puppy dog. Well, I don't think I'd like that either. There's a playfulness about that, isn't there? And then, of course, you have to allow for the body language and the tone of voice. You have to imagine yourself into this situation. You have to allow for the twinkle in the eye. When I was ordained more than 51 years ago, in Wales, in a country parish, and I was the only evangelical in my presbytery, which covered quite a big area of Wales, the Brecon, Radnor, and Herefordshire Presbytery. I was the only evangelical minister, and all the others were trying to get me. It was a denomination that had turned hostile towards the gospel. And there's one guy in particular, just 15 miles up the road, he kept wanting to meet up with me for lunch or let's have a coffee. And I knew why he wanted to do that. He wanted to lure me away from evangelical faith into the wastelands of liberal theology. That was his agenda. It's obvious. In the end, he said to me, I remember him saying this to me, saying, look, you're saying yes with your mouth, but your eyes are saying no. He read me correctly. I had no intention of meeting up with him. And when this woman comes to Jesus begging for his help, the reverse of that is happening in a sense. When she comes to him begging for his help, he says no, but he looks yes. In other words, there's something in the tone of his voice and in the expression on his face that encourages her to persist. Why do I say that? Well, because she does persist, doesn't she? See, imagine, this might be a little speculative, but just imagine now yourself into the situation. Maybe, I think Jesus is maybe picking up on the negative vibes of his disciples. They're so annoyed, that she's interrupted their little break, their little holiday. Get rid of her, they say. She's spoiling our holiday. And so Jesus says, maybe with a backward glance at his scowling disciples, why should I help you? Looking at her, but thinking about them. Why should I help? You know what we Jews call you Gentiles, don't you? Why should I take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs? Yeah, preach it to her, Jesus. Could imagine them saying that, can't you? Tell her. Salvation is of the Jews and you're a Gentile. Now, however you look at it, that's still pretty heavy, isn't it? And it's still pretty offensive. But the remarkable thing about this is she doesn't take offense. Do you see that? In verse 28. Yes, Lord, she says. She doesn't say, but, Lord. She says, yes, Lord. But even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. You see, she doesn't argue with Jesus. She agrees with him. She accepts what Jesus says. She doesn't say, but Lord, that's not fair. I didn't ask to be born and brought up outside of Israel. Anyway, why should you Jews have all the privileges? No. Yes, Lord, she says. And this is so important for us to understand. Whatever arrangements you make to bring sinners to faith, whatever arrangements you make to bring grace to sinners is right, because no one deserves even a crumb of your grace, let alone to sit down at the table and feast on it. If you choose a whole nation to sit at the table, well, that's grace. I'm not going to argue with that. If you choose a whole nation to sit at the table, that's grace. And if you give a little dog a crumb, that's grace. Lord, she says, if there's any grace to be had, please may I have some. And Jesus calls that faith, you see? See what's happening? She's accepting God's plan of salvation. Often when we talk about faith, we're talking about, ourselves and what we want. And no, she understands what she needs to put her faith in. She needs to put her faith in God's arrangement, God's plan of salvation. She accepts that to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles. Do you see? She doesn't quarrel with that. She acknowledges that the Jews have first bite of the cherry. She accepts that the Jews have first place in the economy of God's grace. She simply asks to be fed on the leftovers. And Jesus says to her, look in verse 29, for such a reply you may go. The demon has left your daughter. Now that's an amazing outcome, isn't it? That's the third point. I don't want you to misunderstand what's going on here. This isn't a battle of wits. They're not scoring points off each other. Jesus isn't saying to you, clever woman, you turned the tables on me. You got the better of me there. No, he's simply recognizing in this woman's reply her faith. He's affirming her faith. Matthew makes that plain. Jesus said to her, woman, you have great faith. See, it's not a battle of wits. This is not repartee. They're not sparring partners. Her daughter is demon-possessed. She's desperate. This isn't a subject to quip about. She lays hold of Jesus in her desperation. That's faith. Do you see how faith works? Just look at it with me now. She acknowledges certain truths about Jesus. She calls him Lord. Matthew tells us in his account. She gives him his proper messianic title. She calls him the Son of David. She has such a view of the goodness of Jesus and the greatness of Christ. See, to have the devil cast out of her daughter was her greatest need, and it filled her waking moments. She couldn't think of anything else that she could ask for. It kept her awake at night praying. And for Jesus to do that, well, it's only a crumb of what he's able to do. See, this is great faith, isn't it? It's personal and it's persistent. Spurgeon illustrates it like this. It's a very helpful illustration. He says, this is the way faith works. It's like turning a key in a lock. The same key which locks will also unlock. It all depends on the turn of the key, and still more on the turn of your thoughts. Do you see what he's saying? Looks like the door's locked, doesn't it? Looks like Jesus has shut her out. It looks like Jesus slammed the door in her face. Not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. But do you see what faith does? Instead of going away discouraged, she takes hold of those very same words of Jesus, which seem to lock her out of the kingdom, and she turns them round the other way. To open the door. Yes, Lord, she says, but even dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Yes, Lord, salvation is of the Jews. Yes, Lord, this is how you're working out salvation for the world. You've chosen a nation to reveal yourself. Salvation is of the Jews. And you're the one that they've all been waiting for. And I'm only a Gentile dog. I don't have a place at the table yet. Not yet, not quite yet. But even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the children's table. And so out of what appears to be the most discouraging truth, she finds consolation and help. Do you see? Now that's the way you should read your Bibles. That's the way faith works. I want to say to you that there is not one truth in the Bible that is meant to keep you away from Jesus. The whole Bible is yours to point you to Jesus, isn't it? It's all about him. Take this difficult doctrine of election and predestination, for example, because that's what you've got here. They're his chosen people. God has chosen the Jews to be his people, not because they deserved it. They weren't better or more moral or more promising than any other nation on the face of the earth. No. It's all of his grace. God chose the Jews to be his vehicle for bringing salvation to the world. He chose the Jews to be his chosen people. They are the children at the table, presently being fed in the economy of God's grace. Yes, Lord, she says, but surely if you're a God of such electing sovereign grace that there must be some left over for me. If I can't sit at the table, at least let me crawl under it. You see what she's doing? She's turning the key in the lock, isn't she? See, that's what faith does. So some people see election as a narrow doctrine. It makes God out to be less than generous, parceling out his grace to the chosen few. Where does that idea come from? The chosen few. God told Abraham there'll be more than can be numbered. God is a generous God. He's rich in compassion. He doesn't desire the death of the wicked. This woman understands grace. But some people see election as, as a narrow doctrine. It makes God out to be less than generous. But you see, faith, what is faith? Faith takes hold of the truth of election, and instead of being discouraged, it lays hold of it. So she doesn't say, oh, well, I'm not one of the elect. No, that's unbelief, isn't it? Faith takes hold of this very same truth and turns it like a key in the lock to open the door. A God who can elect a whole nation to such privileges will surely have grace enough and to spare for me. Do you get the point? There is not a doctrine or truth in the Bible that is meant to keep you from coming to Christ. If you think there is, you're reading the Bible the wrong way. It's unbelief that shuts us out and locks up the Bible to us. Faith brings us in. It unlocks all the doors and overcomes all the obstacles. It brings us into this world of truth. That's what's happening here for this poor woman. She's lived all her life just round the corner from the world of truth, a Gentile by birth and upbringing, an alien to the commonwealth of Israel, a stranger to the covenants and promises, without hope and without God in the world. And now by faith, she enters into that world, do you see? She lays hold of Christ. She will not take no for an answer. And isn't that the real irony of this story? That's why Mark places it here where he does, back to back with Israel's unbelief. You know what Israel means, don't you? You know where that name comes from. We saw it in the Old Testament passage that was read to us. It comes from the story of Jacob wrestling with God and prevailing, saying to him, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And God says to him, your name will no longer be Jacob, it'll be Israel, because you struggled with God and have prevailed. Well, you see, if that's what Israel means, this woman is an Israelite, isn't she? Syrophoenician though she may have been by birth and upbringing, she's a true Israelite, isn't she? Because she's wrestled with Jesus, with God in the flesh, and she's prevailed. There's a lovely cheekiness about her faith, isn't there? It's his day off. He's on holiday. The disciples have put a do not disturb sign on his door. That doesn't stop her. He's otherwise engaged. He's the Jewish Messiah. He's been sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That doesn't stop her either. Because the time of the Gentiles is coming. Very soon now, on the day of Pentecost, the ascended Christ will pour out his Spirit on all flesh and fling open the doors for the Gentiles to come in. And she's already there with her foot in the door, isn't she? My friends, we're living in the time of the Gentiles. We're living at the time when Jesus is calling the nations in. This is harvest time. We should be pleading. Our prayer meeting, we don't have prayer meetings, but our prayer meetings should be full of people pleading with God, like this woman is pleading with Jesus. Have mercy. That's what we must be doing. That's what she was doing. If you're living just around the corner from the world of truth, I want to say to you, my friends, this morning, don't stay there. Come in. Take hold of Jesus. If you want to know how to become a Christian, this is what you've got to do. This is it. This is how faith operates. Now is the day of salvation. It's your time now. It's the time of the Gentiles. Now is the accepted time. Now is the day of salvation. Now is the time to come to him as he's presented to you in the gospel. And not just to say, oh yeah, I believe that, and tick it off in your head with some mental assent. No, you've got to come to him and you've got to ask, and you've got to keep on asking, and you've got to seek, and you've got to keep on seeking, and you've got to knock, and you've got to keep on knocking until he opens the door, as he will. That's what faith does. It wrestles with him. It's not just mental assent to certain truths. Keep asking until he opens the door. Keep knocking until he comes into your life. Keep seeking him, and you'll find him. That's what faith does. Ask, seek, knock. Don't let him go until he blesses you, as he surely will, because he is the God of grace, who doesn't deal with us as we deserve. Let's pray. I want to pray this prayer. It's an old prayer. It's sometimes called the prayer of humble access, but it's taken from this passage. We do not presume to come to your table, most merciful Lord, trusting in our own goodness, but in your all-embracing love and mercy. We're not worthy even to gather up the crumbs from under your table. But it is your nature always to have mercy. Lord, feed us. Feed our faith. Feed us with the body and blood of Jesus so that we might live forever in him and he in us. Pass me not, O gentle Saviour. Heed my helpless cry. While on others, Lord, while you're having mercy on others, have mercy on us. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.